I'd like to invite you to think of a map. Not just any map, but a map that has some meaning for you. Maybe it's a map from a fictional world that you visited in a book. The subway map from a city you've always wanted to live in. Maybe it's a map from a hike you took in the backcountry, or that one road trip you took back before Google told us everywhere to go. For me, when I think of maps, I think of the room I grew up in. My father had been subscribing to National Geographic for years, and he built the house that I grew up in. So there were 20 years worth of maps he had, and he used them to wallpaper my room. And whether I was sitting at my desk procrastinating from work or trying to go to sleep at night, I would study those coastlines, the rivers, the cities, and I would know how vast the world was and how far away it all seemed from the tiny village of Higganum, Connecticut, where I grew up. Maps are pictures that have such a power to tell a story to us. And I had no idea when I was studying those maps that I would end up living in Seattle so many years later. So thank you all for being here. My name is Jeff Pettyross. This picture was from my first startup in 1996, back when flannel was stylish for the first time and I had hair. When this picture was taken, 10 terabytes took an entire wall of a data center with a robotic arm, millions of dollars to run this thing. The biggest hard disk you could buy at the time was 8 gigabytes. Fast forward to today, you can buy a 10 terabyte hard disk at Best Buy for $500. And by 2024, according to one estimate, there'll be 24 billion terabytes of data we've all created. What a mess we're making. And what are we going to do with that? I think it's incumbent on us to make sense of all that data out there in the world. Luckily, we can draw on some other people who have figured out how to tell stories with pictures over time. Let's look at paintings. 30,000 years ago was when the first cave paintings we found were made. This is an image from the Lascaux caves in France. And if you look at it, you can see it's a compelling picture. But at the same time, without diminishing its beauty or the historical significance of it, you can see it's a fairly simple image. It's got a couple colors, all the figures are in one plane, there's no sense of perspective. But it started us on this journey of storytelling with pictures. Move forward to the 18th century, before the Common Era, about 4,000 years ago. And here you can see from ancient Egypt, a drawing. This is a priest and his wife beseeching Osiris to sustain them in the afterlife. And much like a lot of the dashboards we make, there's text all across the top there telling the story of what's happening. And if you notice, there are more colors being used now. There's more expressiveness that way. And the human figures are introduced and look more realistic in some sense, but they're very stylized, right, with the torso facing forward and the head off to the side. Go forward a little bit more now. 5th century, BCE. Pardon me. 1,300 years later, the Greeks were starting to try to figure out how to make perspective work on a 2D plane. It's not like they didn't know that if I look at things way off in the distance, they get smaller. No one had just figured out how to draw it right yet. So we worked in this for thousands of years. Here in the 12th century is a watercolor from the Song dynasty. And you can see they've started to capture some of the ideas of perspective. That figures are obscured behind what's in front of them, but the sizes don't change as you get into the distance. This technique of oblique perspective was used in Rome and India and Korea, Japan, China, and more. I think we can all relate to that problem, right? Everyone knew there was something they were trying to describe, a story they were trying to tell about those things just being farther away, but they couldn't figure out how to do it. We've all had that moment in our lives. It wasn't until the 14th century that we finally figured out how perspective worked. And it wasn't until the 15th century that it became popular, when Filippo Brunelleschi came up with a killer demo. He had painted the Duomo, which had just been constructed in Florence, and he cut a peephole in the canvas and put a mirror behind it. So you could see the canvas and the drawing of the Duomo and then walk up to it and look through the peephole and see the Duomo out there and understand he had captured something that had eluded so many other people. And you can see it used here in Botticelli's Annunciazione, how the lines all disappear off to that one point. And at this point, the Italian Renaissance artists were the ones that really ushered linear, realistic perspective into the art world. At the same time, pigments like madder red and ultramarine, lead white, they were all being introduced and added to the palette of humanity for the rest of time. This trend of increased realism continued until the end of the 19th century when the realists were really at their height. And here we can see in Fin du Travail by Jules Breton, they've moved away from figures that have some significance in society to ordinary people working in the field. There's a sense of perspective. You can relate to these characters and their brilliant colors at play. Finally, after 30,000 years of trying to figure out how to capture the real world with paint, we had arrived. And then, a group of upstarts in Paris decided to throw all that away. The Impressionists started working outside the studio. They decided that accuracy actually wasn't that important. They just wanted to gesture in the direction of truth. You can see brush strokes on the canvas, but at the same time there's a sense of light, of movement, of people doing work. Edgar Degas, considered one of the founders of Impressionism, hated that label for himself. He rejected it. He considered himself a realist, because what he was doing was capturing something more real than what you could get with a photographic, accurate image. And you can see how he chose to apply his technique carefully. There's a face of the young woman considering the hat. Is she making the hat? Maybe her lips are pursed because she's holding some pins in her mouth, or she's thinking about whether she wants to buy it. But then look at the decorative work on the hat in the foreground. It's just suggested by some brushstrokes what might be there, some cloth or flowers. And then in the 20th century, the Cubists came along. And the Cubists decided they were just going to throw perspective out the window and use multiple perspectives at the same time. They disassembled the rules that came before them and put them together in novel ways, blowing the modern art world wide open and ushering in an era of creativity. Now, there is still truth here. There's a sense of light borrowed from the Impressionists. There is a sense of concrete subject, right? There's a city here. We can see that city in Robert Delaunay's La Vie numéro 2 from 1910. So painting had to start at one place and slowly over time get to realism before they could decide to break those rules and tell a deeper story, get into something more meaningful. Now, I think data has gone on a similar journey, starting with accuracy first, up into where we are today. So let's trace our predecessors in the world of data. Here, this is one of the first known spreadsheets from ancient Egypt on a papyrus. It is recording a month's worth of deliveries. Turns out, there's no crosstab found of bison being hunted on cave walls yet, but give us time. In the first century of the current era, quipus like this one were created by the Quechua people living in what's now called the Andean Range in South America. It was a key part of the information exchange on that continent for centuries, such that techniques like this were used for both science and accounting by the Inca people when they were dominant on that continent until the 1500s. Hawaii, China, other cultures had similar mechanisms of keeping record with knotted ropes. Now, around the same time that the Incas were studying things like agriculture and crop science, Copernicus was studying the heavens. This is a very scientific spreadsheet. It's 60 years of movement of the sun. And with this table, among others, Copernicus set out his treatise proving that we live in a heliocentric system, where the sun is at the center of the solar system, not the Earth. He published this in 1543. Tables of figures and bookkeeping continued for hundreds more years in this example from the 18th century. Double-entry bookkeeping, by the way, has been around for almost 2,000 years. There's a record right around from the time at the beginning of the Common Era of a reference to people making two entries in different style in different books at the same time. But for all this time, data collection was still slow. It was still painstaking. And for the most part, questions that people had could be answered by just looking at the numbers themselves. There wasn't so much that we had to aggregate it or make other drawings from it. And that all changed in 1979. That was the year that Bob Frankston and Dan Bricklin invented VisiCalc. It was the first killer app for the microcomputer. It took the Apple II from being a hobbyist curiosity into something that was a business necessity. Over 1 million copies of VisiCalc were sold, and it became the first way to digitize data at a mass market scale. And of course, it was followed by Lotus 123 and Excel, and now we have commodity spreadsheets everywhere. At the same time, drum technology and hard drives are being invented for the first time, empowering databases to come to life. And in the 70s, Oracle and DB2 were invented. And now we have petabyte scale technology giving us database in the cloud. So how do we get from all that technology to something like this? I love this picture. Skylar Johnson did this. He published this on Tableau Public. It is a record of every spell that was muttered, flicked, and screamed in the Harry Potter book series. This really captures something, I think, in an impressionistic sense about the books. Because what he wants to do is tell a story from a specific, very visual perspective. And this has taken off. It's had almost 500,000 views so far, and has been featured in such technical publications as Mashable, Cosmopolitan, and Teen Vogue. So Skylar made a choice not to be realistic because he wanted to gesture at our shared understanding of the Harry Potter universe. Now, he could have gone for realism. Would anyone like a crosstab of spells? Now the understandability, like I can understand more detail, right? There's more context here. I can see the word where the spell was uttered in the sentence, but everything about where it happened in the story is gone. So tables and crosstabs are fine for examining detail, but it's like reading code to try to run an app. Now we could have taken a more data-oriented perspective and done a bar chart, for example. Now I see which spells were said the most frequently, but I don't know the context of when, and I think more importantly, it's not very beautiful. It doesn't compel us, it doesn't draw us in, it doesn't give us that sense of sort of magic and wonder that you get from something like this rainbow palette. So how can we bring a sense of design to our work, like Skylar does? I find I can get inspired by looking at examples around us. Here's some more very boring, dry data. Unless you happen to be captaining a ship with a deep draft in the San Francisco Bay, you probably don't care about the tide chart at this level of detail. It doesn't really capture the imagination. But this is a piece called Tidal Memory. In San Francisco, there's a wonderful interactive science museum called the Exploratorium, and this sits in a room with large windows looking out over the San Francisco Bay. What they did is they decided, or the artist who created Tidal Memory, took 24 measurements out of this literal ocean of data and brought to life that magic interface between the water and the sky. You can move around this and get a sense of the weight of the water and what it actually feels like to be in it. There's something very meaningful about how they brought to life these 24 measurements. Here's something else that inspires me from Dear Data. Georgia Lupi and Stephanie Posavec decided that for 52 weeks they were going to mail each other a postcard once every week, capturing some part of their lives. And this is how they told the story of laughter from 1 week of their lives. Now, they could have captured all the same data with a histogram or a line chart. But this is so much more expressive. Their laughter blooms and pops on the page. It captures the joy of the moment of laughter. One more inspiring example. This is another map. This one was hanging on my wall on top of the other maps. I put this one up. It's a map of the universe from National Geographic. And I would study this as a kid. It has our solar system in the bottom right, and then it zooms out, and you see galaxies and galactic clusters, and finally the fabric of the known universe. For hours, I would study the details in this, memorizing acronyms like NGC, and seeing where we've been and where we're going on a cosmic scale. There's just something inherently fascinating about telling stories in a compelling way with beautiful imagery. Don't they just draw you in? So what can we learn from this in our practice? Well, I find something compelling about this drawing. It's another cave drawing. This one from a little bit more recently than 30,000 years ago, but there's an immediacy to it. Despite the fact that it's simple, despite the fact that any one of us could probably draw something of similar sort of skill level, if you will, there's something about it that draws us in. In order to create beauty, in order to leverage it in our data visualizations, I think what we need to do is simply practice it. Do it over and over so we can take it from drawings of cows to something that is subtle and beautiful and invites our users to do something more meaningful. So what I'd like to do for the next section of the talk is introduce some ideas of things you can do in Tableau today to make our visualizations more compelling. I'm going to start with a sort of a longer demo talking about some data from Las Vegas. The city of Las Vegas, like many of the large cities in the world, has published a lot of their data. So last week I went and downloaded 30 years of business license applications from Las Vegas. So let's take a look at that together. So I'm going to start off and I'm going to drag out the number of license applications on the columns. And when I drop it, we'll see that in the last 30 years, there have been about 97,000 applications for business licenses here in Las Vegas. Now, what have those licenses been looking into? What have they been trying to start businesses for? I'm going to pick up a category group and drop it on rows. And we'll see that personal services, housing and lodging, and retail make up the lion's share of this data. As a matter of fact, it's a little bit over half the records. To my surprise, when I saw this, gambling and gaming has only accounted for 1,600 of those licenses. So, as I dug around the data some more, I found something interesting. This is all the license applications, when they were accepted, rejected, died out over time, and so forth. So which licenses ended up getting terminated the most, I wanted to find out. So to dig into that, I'm going to turn this into a scatter plot. First, I'm going to change this into a shape. All the marks are in the same place. We'll take category group and move it from rows down to detail. So we still have all the same marks, but now they're just in a line. And I'm going to drag out number of terminated licenses and put that on the vertical axis by dropping it on the rows shelf. And we can see now, if you look at the bottom, here are those 3 high volume license applications. And all these down here follow a fairly similar trend. Roughly speaking, given the number of applications, there's a similar number of terminated applications or terminated licenses. But there's just one outlier up there. Turns out that's alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana related businesses. That could be an interesting story. I'm curious about that. So how can we invite people in to study this data with us? Well, I'm not an expert at painting by any stretch, but I've taken a couple of painting classes. And one thing that I notice the instructors always go around and yell at everyone to do is to fill the entire canvas out to the edge. So how can we add some beauty to this with some imagery? So there's a couple websites I'd like to tell you about. Starting here with this one, Pixabay. Pixabay, I don't know, my practice until I heard about Pixabay and the other one I'm going to show you is I would go to Google Images, I would look for something, and it'd often be small or copyrighted. Pixabay, on the other hand, has giant images. So if I want to look for something like Las Vegas so I can tell a story about it, I can type that in, hit enter, and I get a series of images about Las Vegas. Certainly they're compelling, and I get an immediate sense of place when I look at these. But when I think about how to use these in the context of data visualization, what I'm looking for is sort of an open blank canvas in which to put this scatter plot we made. So there's some flat area here, but for the most part, this is all very high contrast, kind of noisy photography. So I'm going to look somewhere else. I'm going to go to Unsplash. Now, I noticed that I'm going to be throwing out lots of words, lots of names, lots of sites, services, applications, things like that. You're welcome to take notes as you go, of course, but I want to let you know at the end of the talk, I've got a slide with everything listed in one place. And after the conference, you can also go to the TC website and download a PDF I've made of all these links as well. So if you want to sit back and enjoy, you can do that too. So let's go ahead and search for Las Vegas here on Unsplash. And already I'm starting to see something with a little bit more promise. Here's a little bit more open area in this image. I could maybe put the scatter plot here. I'm going to scroll down. Now I did find one here earlier that I like, so pardon me while I scroll at a stomach churning speed. So I want to get to this one right here. I kind of like this image for a couple reasons. One, it has that nice big open space on which we can tell our story, but also it's standing outside the city and it has a sense of like loneliness or loss. And since we're talking about canceled or terminated business licenses, I like that connection. So I'm going to go ahead and download this image. And when I do, I get this message here. Say thanks. And it talks about crediting. So these images are all free, but I want to take note of the fact that Isaac Davis published this photo. Now he did it with the intent of spreading his name and generating business, so I wanted to honor that and give his name later. So we'll take note of that, but for now, let's go and put this image into Tableau. I'll come back to our workbook. I'm going to start a new dashboard where we can put this picture. Over here in the Objects pane, I'm going to select Image and drag it out and drop it. Tableau will ask me to pick a picture, so I'm going to choose, and there's that photo there in my downloads. I'm going to say Fit Image, and we have it in Tableau. Now, as I mentioned, all the painting teachers I've ever had have yelled at me to fill the entire canvas, so let's fill out this space here. Having played with this photo before, I happen to know that this one works particularly well at the very intuitive 1348 by 900 pixels. I could drag you through the process of figuring that out, but this is a little bit more interesting. Now, you'll notice there's still a white gutter around the edge, though. How can we take care of that? Well, it turns out we've got the photo container, and then there's the dashboard container around it. By default, Tableau adds some padding around those edges because it does help with most dashboardings, but in this case, I do want the image to go full bleed all the way out to the edge. So I'm going to remove the 4 pixels of outer padding here from the photo. And then I also want to remove the outer padding from this outside container as well. As you can see, there are 8 pixels of padding there. Take that down to 0, and when I do that, now we've got that photo filling up the entire dashboard. So I'm going to switch back to the Dashboard tab. Well, I can pick up that scatter plot we made and drop it in here. Now, that bright white doesn't look so good against that beautiful background, and I think this space over here I'd like to use for text later. So I'm going to turn off the title, and now I'd like to format this scatter plot so it looks better on that background. So I'm going to say Format Shading, and over here I have one option which says None, and if I choose that, you'll see it lets that photo show through in a very attractive way. But there's one trick. When I go back to look at this sheet now, that dark background from the photo isn't going to apply in the sheet if I switch back over there for a moment. So what I'm going to do while I'm still working on this, while we still have a draft of it, I'm going to change the background color of that sheet to be a nice dark color. That way when we switch over to look at it and work with it some more, it's going to be similar to what we're looking at. Now, you also want to take those grid lines and lighten them up, and take this text and make it lighter so you can see them as well. I'm just going to fast forward through that process there because we can end up with this much more quickly. But all I did was just adjust some colors in the formatting to get us here. Now looking at this, I would like to bring more color into play here. So there are these 3 high volume license applications out here. There's sort of more that are lower level or sort of like I would say normal level of license applications. And then there's our one outlier out here. Now to pull colors together for this, I have a couple choices. One, I can certainly go in and go to the sheet, and I'm going to color those in 3 separate groups. Prior to the talk, I created something called category clusters. It's just a group on top of that, and when I drop it on color, we'll see we get 3 different color categories. But it's using the same default 3 colors that Tableau puts everywhere. Now, they're well chosen. I know Maureen Stone, she designed this palette with great attention and care, but what I'd like to do is tie these colors into the story we're telling on this picture. So I'm going to introduce you to another tool called Adobe Color. What Adobe Color does is it lets you build a 5-color palette. And here I can see these 5 colors, not related to the story we're telling. But I have a choice up here to extract colors from an image. So I will choose that and select a file from my computer, and I'll pick that picture from Isaac Davis. And here we can see we're looking at that picture, and what these little dots let me do is choose colors from the image. So I'm going to choose 3 colors that I think would work well in our scatter plot. And looking at this picture of Las Vegas, I can see that Down here on the strip, we've got some really beautiful purple, so maybe I'll pull one of those out. And then here, I noticed some beautiful greens. We can pull those in as well. And then of course there's all the bright golden lights of Las Vegas. This one's actually pretty good. Maybe I can make it a little bit lighter. So now I've got a purple, a gold, and a green that I can use in this picture, from this picture. So going back to Tableau, let me show you how to pick those colors up and use them in your dashboard. I'm going to go back to the sheet where I can edit the colors. And first I'm going to change the color for alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. I'm going to double click, which brings up my color chooser. I'm going to double click again, and now I get an eyedropper. This is on a Mac. There are similar controls you can get to on Windows. But I'm going to pick up the eyedropper and come down here, and I lost my green. That was not very nice of you, Adobe. Let me pick that up again. There we go. I'm going to pick up my green right here. Now this green is a little bit dark to stand out against that background. And you'll notice there are lots of different ways you can choose and customize colors. Often, the thing you'll see the most is RGB, red, green, blue, because that's what web developers will use. When I'm choosing colors for dashboards, I like doing HSB or HSV because what that does is it lets you lock in a color, a hue, but then adjust how saturated or bright the color is. So I'm just going to make that green a little bit lighter. And now I'm going to choose for the higher volume businesses. I'll go ahead and pick up that gold. And goodness gracious, I'm not going to go and pick that purple up again. I'm going to pick this purple and customize it a little bit instead. There we go. So now we've got our three colors that match the image that we have here in the background of the dashboard. Okay, this is starting to pull together into something a little bit more compelling than just a basic scatter plot. But there's more here as well, in that there's some imagery I could pull in that would help tell the story of what each of these shapes is. Because as I glance at this, I don't know what those dots are. But each of them represents a kind of business. So how could we pull that in? For example, this one here is retail. Well, all of us have an idea of some images in our mind that retail might conjure. Or personal services. So another site I'd like to introduce you to is something called the Noun Project. The Noun Project is, as it says, icons for, well, just about anything. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to search for service, for example. And when I do, I can see we have got this extensive library of icons from which we can draw. Now, as I scroll through, one thing I'd like to invite you to notice is that the images all have a slightly different drawing style. Some of them are more realistic, some are less, some have heavy strokes in the lines, some have light strokes, some are filled, some are not filled. As I'm going to build a palette of these shapes for my dashboard, what I'd like to do is choose similar styles, so it feels like I've created something from one family. So let's say, for example, for service, I wanted to pull this hand icon in. So I'm going to click on it, I get a preview of the icon, and I'm going to say this is the one I want, so I'll choose Get This Icon. Now, the Noun Project offers me two choices, Pro Download or Basic Download. Pro Download is a $2.99 royalty-free license. Now, if you're not familiar with how the art world works, why is it $2.99 and free at the same time? Well, what this means is you're going to pay for it exactly once, then you never have to pay for it again. Or you can do a basic download, which means you have to make an attribution to the creator of the icon. So that's what I'm going to do again for this dashboard, because I don't want to pay $3 for every single icon. I'll choose Continue, and it offers me two choices. These are two different file formats, PNG and SVG. Tableau understands PNG and not SVG, so I'm going to go ahead and choose that, and it will download the icon to my computer. When I open it up, I can see it's automatically added in the credit for this icon for me. Now, in the fine print of the Noun Project, it says if you're going to use the icons at a small size, you don't need to keep that text there, you can put the attribution somewhere else. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to choose this image, I'm going to crop it down to remove that text, and I'm going to save it in a folder that I'll show you in a moment. I'm going to call it Service. I'm going to put it off in my Tableau repository. Specifically, I'm going to put it in the Shapes folder in my Tableau repository, and then I've created a folder in there called Business Types. You can see I've collected some other icons here already. I'm going to go ahead and set the Service icon there. Now to pull these into Tableau, I'm going to change my category group from just being on level of detail to being on shape. And when I do that, Tableau chooses a default shape encoding using some shapes that we've created. But what I'd like to do is use those custom shapes. So I will click on the shape drop target here, and I'm going to say from the select shape palette dropdown, choose business types. Here you'll see a list. This list is all the folders that you saw on my computer earlier inside the shaped folder inside my Tableau repository. So I'll choose business types and we'll see all those icons there. And one trick about doing this is I could go through and pick them one at a time and assign them. But if you put the icons in the folder in alphabetical order, in the same order they appear in this list, with one click you can say assign palette and all the shapes get added at once. So we'll do that, and I come back to Tableau and I have these very teeny icons. So let's make them a little bit bigger so we can see them. And now we can see retail is represented by some bags, alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana by a bottle of alcohol and a glass, and so forth. Coming back here, now we're starting to tell the story in a more visual, compelling way that actually tells something more at first glance. Now the last thing I want to do is add that credit that I talked about. So I'm just going to fast forward to that step here. I've added some text to describe it, and a couple things I've done. I've given credit to the place where I found the data I pulled it from, and even if you're using corporate data inside the firewall, it's good to cite the source so someone knows where it came from. And then here, icons, here's all the people that created the icons using this visualization, and finally, Isaac Davis for his photo. Now, I've created custom colors here, and one challenge with that is 1 out of every 10 men and a similarly but slightly smaller number of women have trouble seeing some colors. It's called color vision deficiency, and there are a number of tools that help us work through as I have standard vision, normal vision, and I like using this tool called Color Oracle. Color Oracle is something you can download and install on your computer. It'll let you choose options like do Terra Nokia, which is that condition that affects about 10% of men. So when I choose do Terra Nokia, it repaints my entire screen, showing me roughly what most people with red-green color deficiency might see. And I can see that my colors actually still stand fairly well apart, though this grayish color might be too close to these over here, so I might want to go in and reconsider my colors. Now, I know that many of you can't install your own software on computers at work, so I want to introduce you to another option as well. Chromatic Vision Simulator is a web-based tool that does something very similar to Color Oracle. What you can do is take a screenshot of your screen, upload it there, and then choose different options to see how it looks for people with different forms of color vision deficiency. And one last tool about color palettes, ColorBrewer, lets you hand create custom palettes, colorbrewer2.org. Created by Cynthia Brewer and her team, it also offers interesting options like if you're going to be printing this out later, you're going to be photocopying it to help you choose colors and patterns that'll survive those kind of manipulations. Whew, all right, so we got through a lot about colors, images, and shapes. Now I've got a series of sort of smaller ideas to throw at you about more ways we can integrate creativity, more small practices we can do to get more and more rich with how we tell our stories. Oh, and on the topic of telling stories, let's make some stuff up. You know, Cubists added multiple perspectives to their drawings, and as my friend Zach says, the data is not all in the data. Sometimes the data is in your head. What does that mean? Well, geography is a great example of where the data is sometimes in your head, and where a single perspective doesn't tell the entire story. Now, we like using Mercator projections like this one when we tell stories about geographic data. It's really simple because lat long maps out into a nice grid, so it's super easy for us to use. But the problem is, any two-dimensional map is a projection of this squashed sphere that our Earth is onto a 2D plane. So what it does is it takes Texas and Greenland. Now, Greenland, it turns out, is not that big. Greenland could only hold 3 Texases. But as you can see in the Mercator projection, anything close to the poles gets blown way out of proportion. So one way to overcome this is to make stuff up. This is not what the United States looks like on a real map, but there are many instances where this is exactly what I want to see. If I'm looking at sales regions, I want to know what's happening in each state. If I'm looking at what's going on in the US Senate, Rhode Island has just as much power in the Senate as Texas. So a hex map like this can help tell the story more accurately. So let's take a look at how you can build something like this in Tableau. So the first place I started here is by making something up. In this case, I made up a grid of the United States. This is a 51 row sheet, because there's also one spot in here for District of Columbia, though I did leave out the outlying territories. And you can see I made up X and Y coordinates, places where these states are all going to fall in a scatter plot that's going to look like that hex map. So I took this spreadsheet that I built in Google Sheets, and I'm going to pull it into Tableau now. So here I've got that data source loaded into Tableau. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the X pixel and spread it out horizontally on columns, the Y pixel value and spread it out in rows, and add one mark for each state, and now you can see the beginnings of that hex map. I just chose numbers that made this work out pretty well. Now I can quickly go in and do things like hide these headers, because if I'm looking at a map, you don't usually have axes on a map. That's kind of strange. And I can remove the lines in the background as well. There's 3 of them: grid lines, 0 lines, and axis rulers. Okay, now we're starting to look like the blank canvas on which we usually paint a map. Here, though, we can see it's a bunch of circles, and what I would really like to do is tile those hexagons together. So to do that, I'm going to change this from the basic circle shape, and I created another custom image, a hexagon. This is also available for download in that PDF that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So when I choose that, actually I have to choose it though, Jeff. I'll change to the custom folder where I put that shape, choose it, and now we have our hex map starting to come together. Now they're not quite tiled together, so let's see if we can make them a little bit bigger. That's a little closer, and one thing you'll notice, I'm going to resize this window a little bit, and you'll see those hexagons keep their same size even though the canvas in which they're being painted is changing. So we get to solve that by putting in a dashboard and making that container in which the map sits a fixed size so the proportion never changes. We'll get there in a moment. But first, let's add some meaning to this. I'd like to take some real data, or some fake data, Superstore in this case, and add it on top of the hex. So I'm going to put my profit on color, starting to get somewhere, and I'd like to also understand my sales at the same time, so I can add it as a label. And I'm going to drop sales on the label target. Now I want to put those numbers right in the middle of the mark. So to do that, there's 2 things you want to do. One, you want to change the alignment to be center and center. And the other thing you want to do is you want to allow the labels to overlap other marks. Because as these shapes start getting close to each other, Tableau would otherwise think that they're overlapping each other and remove the text too soon. Now I see there are a few places where I don't have data in the set, like Alaska and Hawaii. So let's go ahead and pull those out. I'm going to add a filter on sales and simply say I only want non-null values. We're getting closer to our map. I'm going to create a dashboard now, drag this map in, and now I can pick exactly the size I want to get the tiled effect that I want, however I want it to be. Now another idea too is you could choose to do variable sizes on purpose. So you can use size as part of your hex map here, where I've got 1 value on color, 1 value on size, and a 3rd one on text. So you can add a lot of information into a hex map this way. Now, I'm not the first person to use a hex map by any stretch of the imagination. I wanted to show this example from The Guardian. This is how they're showing the elections that are unfolding in Spain right now. What they've done is they've decided that they wanted to actively choose. They wanted to make up, this is not how Spain looks, certainly not those colors, but also not those shapes. But they wanted to be able to tell the story about something about the proportion of the population that contributed to each of the voting blocks, so they redrew Spain like this. They have maps like this for most of the major areas of the world. My friend Kim Reese did something similar. She wanted to tell a story about people who had been killed by gunfire. And she made up data to add to that story, where she used estimated life expectancy estimations, and took a guess at how many years were lost to gunfire and built that into the visualization she created. So by making stuff up, by taking the ideas we have in our head and adding it to the data, we can tell a more rich and compelling story. Another idea I'd like to introduce is getting random. The pointillist had the right idea. Georges Seurat, when he painted this, did not paint any color directly. He used points of other colors to create the impression of something that had texture and light and shadow. Now in data, sometimes we can't get right to the point we want because they're all on top of each other. It happens a lot in maps, and it happens a lot in scatterplots. So in data, I'd like to introduce you to something called jittering, where you can take points and spread them out a little bit so you can make actually more sense by introducing randomness. Let's see how that works. So here I'm looking at some information about discount. This is every single sale represented by one dot and the amount of discount on that sale. If I want to understand about how this discount is being used in my business, I can't really tell what's going on here. There's a lot of hidden value buried inside these marks. And this is what happens when we do things that aggregate at levels that are too high. But if I try to drill down, so I'm going to go from the month level down to the day level, well, I certainly see more marks, and there's a lot of information that there were no discount at the 0% level and a lot of discount at the 20% level, and some others scattered around, but I can't really tell more about that 20% number. So what if I could just shake things up a little bit? What if we could spread them out a little bit? Well, the measure I'm using right now is average discount. What I'd really like to do is take that average discount and move it around a little bit within reason. So I created this calculated field called discount with jitter. Let's take a look at what that looks like. I did not want to copy it, I wanted to edit it. So discount with jitter has three pieces. First, it's got the measure that I want to shake up a little bit, average of discount. Second, it's got this thing called random in it. This is not in the Tableau documentation, I don't know why, but random is a function that every time your data refreshes will give you a number between 0 and 1, like 0.24, 0.75, and so forth. And I'm multiplying that by a parameter I created called jitter size, and in this case, jitter size is a small number that operates in a level like percentages. And finally, I don't just want to add this random factor of jitter, I also want to take half of it back out. That way the jitter spreads out evenly around the original value instead of just adding on top of it. So this is my discount with jitter calculation. I'm going to go ahead and replace discount with jitter. Nothing's happened yet because that parameter I mentioned, the jitter size, is right now 0. So let's show the parameter control. And you can see up here that value is 0. But now as I increase the size of that parameter and start introducing some jitter, you can see the marks start to spread out with every click. And now I can see there's actually a little bit more information inside that discount. There's a little bit of heavier discount going on in September, November, and December, but I see maybe that's a reflection of the number of orders that are happening in those months as well. But I've gotten new insight by being able to add some randomness to my data. Now, one other thing I'd like to show you that is another way to get at this, I'm going to take the jitter size and take it back down to 0. Tableau recently added also density plots. We showed this at TC last year on the Dev Stage keynote. And here you can start seeing that the density plot will also start teasing that information out a little bit. It's a little hard to see here, but I can do things like tweak the intensity or tweak the opacity to draw out that meaning as well. And I'll leave it to you to figure out, and actually the size is another way to access some of that underlying meaning. So density and jitter plots do similar things to get at that data when it's all stacked on top of each other and you can't draw out the meaning. So, building on the pointillists and what they did, my colleague Sarah Battersby at Tableau came up with this as well. So instead of jittering completely randomly, she came up with an algorithm where you can actually spiral out from the original data point. So even though all these things that are happening, maybe it's observations in the field or sales at a given zip code or something like that, you can see all the individual marks that make up the data by just spreading it out a little bit. She wrote a blog post about that that outlines how you write that formula to make that happen. Now, as I'm throwing all this stuff out at you, pick colors, pick pictures, add shapes, add randomness, I also want to encourage us to really think closely and carefully about how we do that. color can have lots of meaning. The original image here is on the left. It's from the South China Morning Post. Simon Scar did this back in 2011. And he was trying to tell this dramatic story about the number of people who had been killed in the Iraq War. And so he chose to use dark red and hang it down so it looks like dripping blood. And it's one dramatic way to tell the story. My colleague and friend at Tableau, Andy Cotgreave, took that same image, changed the color, flipped it vertically, and created the image on the right. Those are exactly the same chart, just one is upside down and blue. And he changed the title to say, Deaths on the Decline. Neither perspective is particularly right or wrong, but the use of color and the choice to invert the axis tell two very different ways of looking at the exact same data. So we need to be careful about what we choose. Here's another example of how shape can influence things. Back when we did that Scatterplot together about the business licenses in Las Vegas, I happened to choose the one on the left instead of the one on the right for alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. Well, it wasn't an accidental choice, because it turns out that business is dominated by alcohol, and there's a little bit of tobacco in there, and almost no marijuana business licenses. So now, that could be a result of the fact that it's 30 years of data, and legalization was much sooner. We can start asking more questions about it. What I want to be careful of is not to do something that might vilify or tell a story about some part of the data that wasn't actually even in there. A third thing to consider is what's the level of detail at which you want to show things. So this is a very realistic image. It is a photograph of a black-headed gull. Now, one could argue this has all the information you could possibly want about a black-headed gull, except if you look at something like this. This is also a picture of a black-headed gull, but this was done by a naturalist painter. It was actually part of the Audubon collection. They've just released about 300 beautiful images of birds to the public domain. And I think that what they've done, if you look at anatomical drawings or nature drawings like this, they take a bit of a Cubist perspective, because not only is there perspective from a distance, they've layered on what happens close up as well. So you can see here the detail about the shape of the feathers and how they are built in a way that is not apparent from a photo, and the photo will never show you from the same distance. All right, I want to wrap up with one last concern about ethics. I kind of gestured in the direction of ethics when I talked about how do you choose colors and shapes and level of detail. But it's really important that we do right with data. Remember, with all those petabytes of data that we're working with, we're the gatekeepers. As people who are creating dashboards, it's important for us to tell a realistic story. Picasso had an interesting idea about this. He's one of the most famous Cubists. The full quote is, "In my opinion, to search means nothing in painting. To find is the thing." We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie that makes us realize truth, at least the truth that is given to us to understand. The artist must know the manner whereby to convince others of the truthfulness of their lies. Now, we are lying all the time with data. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but we're lying to get at the truth. I used to work in radio. I did morning news. And every morning I would have time to do 5 stories. So that just meant I got to pick which 5 stories we were going to tell that day. No matter how important number 6 and number 7 were, I got to choose. And I do remember there were times that there were stories I thought were more important, in my opinion, is what shaped the news for the people who listened to the radio that morning. So we all get to do that as well. How do we aggregate? What do we filter out? What do we leave in? What do we include in the dashboards? What views we put just one click away? Think about a time that you might have seen a truth revealed by a lie. Now, that's not saying we should lie outright. If you're doing a bar chart, do not remove your 0. And it also doesn't mean that including all the numbers and using your axes at 0 is the right thing to do. This is the average global temperature in Kelvin since the 1850s. The facts here are completely accurate. This is exactly what it's looked like over all those years. But it turns out, if you ask the experts in the data, this is the wrong way to look at it. Because when you're looking at temperature data, anomalies, changes in temperature, are much more important than absolute temperatures. Anomalies or absolute only applies over very short distances if you're going to do real science on it. Anomalies at a month or year aggregations can actually represent regions out to thousands of kilometers. So these numbers, when you look at them at the global scale, is the most accurate way to look at it. Science works. So, I promised this slide would be here. I will leave it up for a moment if you want to take a picture of it. This is a lot of the resources that I listed. These are also listed in the PDF that's available for download on the conference website after the conference. So I'd just like to wrap up and come back to how we started today's journey. Hopefully all of us with a map that captured our imagination. Now we followed the journey of 30,000 years of people striving to tell stories with paintings, and the parallel trip taken by our forebears in the world of data. Now, like the painters who were standing at the opening of the 20th century, we have the opportunity to choose what tools we use, how we're going to tell the story, how we're going to use color and shape and imagery to bring these stories to life. So I encourage you all to be creative, tell the story in a compelling way, and for goodness sake, please don't lie. Thank you very much for your time.